I ran through the darkness toward a farm I'd never seen before, and the moment I stepped onto that land, a horse I'd never met walked straight up to me and pressed its forehead against my chest like it had been waiting 17 years for me to come home. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button real quick. Tomorrow I'm sharing a story that's going to completely blow your mind. I left Riverside Girls' Home at exactly 12:43 in the morning on October 9th. I know the precise time because I'd been watching the clock on the common room wall for 3 hours, waiting until I was certain everyone was asleep. The night supervisor, Miss Caroline, made her final rounds at midnight, and I'd learned her pattern over the past 6 months. 12:15, she'd check the bathrooms. 12:30, she'd look in on the younger girls. 12:40, she'd settle into her office with her phone and a cup of tea. And that's when I made my move. I wasn't running away because anyone hurt me or because the home was terrible. Riverside was actually one of the better places I'd been during my 11 years in the system. But something had happened 3 days earlier that changed everything, and I couldn't stay there another night pretending nothing was wrong. It started when Mrs. Palmer, the administrative director, called me into her office with this weird look on her face, like she was excited and scared at the same time. She had a file folder on her desk, thin and worn at the edges, with my name written across the tab in faded blue ink. "Lily," she said, gesturing for me to sit, "I found something in the archives that I think you should see." I'd been at Riverside since I was 6 years old. Before that, I'd been in 3 different foster homes and another group facility. My mother had died when I was 3, some kind of accident the social workers never fully explained. No father listed on any documents, no other family that anyone could locate. I was used to dead ends and missing information, so I didn't get excited about the folder. But what Mrs. Palmer showed me made my hands shake. It was an intake form from when I first entered the system at 3 years old. Most of it was standard information, medical history, emergency contacts, all blank or marked unknown. But at the bottom, in the section labeled Personal Effects, someone had written, "One photograph, wooden horse figurine, and note saying Willowbrook Farm, Montana, when she's ready." "We never gave you these items," Mrs. Palmer said quietly. "They should have been held in storage until you aged out. But somehow they were misfiled. I only found them because we're digitizing old records." She opened a manila envelope and pulled out a photograph so faded I could barely make out the details. But I could see a young woman, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of a red barn with mountains in the background. She was holding a baby, and even though the photo quality was poor, I could see that the baby had the same dark curly hair I had, the same wide-set eyes. "That's my mother," I whispered, touching the photo with trembling fingers. "We believe so," Mrs. Palmer confirmed. The wooden horse figurine was small, carved from a single piece of light-colored wood, smooth and detailed. Someone had spent hours crafting it, and I could feel the love in every curve. But it was the note that broke something open inside me. Written on yellowed paper in careful handwriting were just those words, "Willowbrook Farm, Montana, when she's ready." "Do you know where this farm is?" I asked. Mrs. Palmer shook her head. "I searched property records and couldn't find any active listing for a Willowbrook farm in Montana. It's possible it doesn't exist anymore, or the name changed. I'm sorry, Lily. I know this opens more questions than answers. I took the items back to my room and spent the next 3 days staring at them, trying to understand what they meant. Why had my mother left me a message about a farm? Why had these items been kept from me for 14 years? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information now? That's when I made my decision. I was 17 years old, 6 months away from aging out anyway. I had $300 saved from my part-time job at the grocery store, a bus pass, and nothing tying me to Riverside except routine and fear of the unknown. If there was even a chance that Willowbrook Farm was real, that it was connected to my mother and could tell me something about where I came from, I had to find it. So, at 12:43 on that October morning, I slipped out of my room with a backpack containing everything I owned: the photograph, the wooden horse, the note, 3 changes of clothes, and my savings stuffed into an envelope. I moved through the darkened hallways like a ghost, and when I pushed open the emergency exit that I'd disabled earlier by taping over the latch, the cold night air hit my face like a baptism. I didn't have a clear plan beyond getting to Montana. Riverside was in Ohio, which meant I had about 1,500 miles to cover with limited resources and no legal way to travel since I was still a minor. But I'd spent years learning how to be resourceful, how to make myself invisible when necessary, and how to trust my instincts above everything else. I walked 4 miles to the Greyhound station, keeping to side streets and shadows. The first bus heading west didn't leave until 5:30 in the morning, so I spent those hours in the station bathroom, trying to look older and more confident than I felt. When the ticket counter finally opened, I bought a ticket to Billings, Montana, which took most of my money but got me within 100 miles of where I needed to be. The bus ride took 2 days with stops in Indianapolis, Chicago, and a dozen smaller cities I'd never heard of. I slept in uncomfortable seats, ate vending machine food, and tried not to think about what would happen. When Riverside discovered I was gone, they'd file a missing persons report, contact local police, and probably assume I'd run away with some boyfriend or gotten into trouble. They wouldn't guess that I was chasing a ghost and a note written by a mother I couldn't remember. Montana looked different than I expected. I'd imagined flat prairies and cowboys, but the landscape that unrolled outside the bus windows was all rolling hills, pine forests, and distant mountains cutting sharp lines against enormous skies. It was beautiful and terrifying in its vastness, making me feel both insignificant and strangely at home. I arrived in Billings at 3 in the afternoon on my second day of travel, exhausted and down to my last $40. The bus station had an information desk, and I asked the woman working there if she'd ever heard of Willowbrook Farm. "Can't say I have," she said, barely looking up from her phone. "Montana's got about 1,000,000 farms, honey. You got an address, or a county at least?" I showed her the note, but she just shrugged. "Could be anywhere. You might try asking at feed stores or checking with the county assessor's office. They keep property records." I didn't have time or money to go through official channels, so I did something that probably wasn't smart, but felt necessary. I started asking people: the cashier at a gas station, a rancher filling his truck at the pump, an elderly couple eating lunch at a diner. Most people had never heard of Willowbrook Farm, but I kept asking because I didn't know what else to do. Finally, on my third attempt at a different diner, A waitress named Betty stopped pouring coffee and stared at me. Willowbrook Farm, she repeated slowly. I haven't heard that name in probably 20 years. It's way out in the back country, about 60 miles northeast of here. Is it still operating? My heart hammered. I don't know. I'm trying to find it. Betty studied me with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than I wanted to share. You got people there? Maybe, I said. It's complicated. She nodded like she understood complicated. It's not an easy place to find. The roads out that way aren't well marked, and you need a vehicle. You got transportation? I shook my head. Betty sighed, made a decision, and pulled out her phone. My nephew Danny runs supplies out to some of the remote ranches. He's heading that direction tomorrow morning. Let me see if he'll give you a ride. I spent that night in a women's shelter, lying awake and wondering if I was crazy. I'd run away from the only stability I'd known to chase a note and a gut feeling. But every time doubt crept in, I'd pull out the wooden horse and run my fingers over its smooth surface, and something inside me would steady. This was right. I knew it the way you know some truths without evidence. Danny turned out to be a guy in his mid-20s with a pickup truck full of feed and supplies. He was quiet but friendly, and he didn't ask too many questions. When I climbed into his passenger seat at 6 in the morning, Betty said you're looking for Willowbrook Farm, he said as we pulled onto the highway. That place has been abandoned for years. Old woman who owned it died. I don't know. 15, maybe 20 years ago. No family to claim it far as anyone knew, so it just sits there. County would have seized it for back taxes, but somebody's been paying them. Anonymous payments every year like clockwork. My pulse quickened. Do you know how to get there? Yeah, I've driven past it a few times. It's pretty remote, about 10 miles off the main road down a dirt track. Not sure what you'll find there besides empty buildings and ghosts. We drove for over an hour, the landscape getting progressively more rural and wild. Finally, Danny turned onto a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest. The trees were so thick that sunlight barely penetrated, and I felt like we were driving into another world. This is it, Danny said, pulling to a stop where the road widened into a clearing. Willowbrook Farm. I stepped out of the truck and my breath caught. The farm spread out before me like something from a dream I'd forgotten I'd had. A 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, faded but still beautiful. A large red barn with mountains rising behind it, exactly like the photograph. Smaller outbuildings scattered across the property, and fields that had gone wild with tall grass and wildflowers. And everywhere, animals. Horses grazed in an overgrown pasture. Chickens scratched in the dirt near the barn. Goats climbed on old fence posts, and I could see cattle in the distance. For a supposedly abandoned farm, it was very much alive. Huh, Danny said, clearly surprised. That's not what I expected. Somebody must be taking care of the place. I walked forward slowly, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, and that's when the first impossible thing happened. A chestnut horse in the near pasture lifted its head, looked directly at me, and started walking toward the fence. Not trotting or running, but walking with purpose, its eyes locked on mine. When it reached the fence line, it stopped and made a low, whinnying sound that vibrated through my chest. I approached carefully, hand extended, even though I'd never been around horses and had no idea what I was doing. The horse leaned over the fence and pressed its forehead against my chest, blowing warm breath against my shirt, and I felt tears spring to my eyes without understanding why. Well, that's something, Danny muttered behind me. Horses don't usually warm up to strangers like that. But it didn't feel like we were strangers. It felt like recognition. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. Over the next few minutes, more animals approached. The chickens clustered around my feet, clucking softly. A border collie I hadn't noticed before trotted up and sat directly on my boot, leaning its weight against my leg. Even the goats came down from their perches to investigate, one of them trying to eat my shoelace, while another pushed its head under my free hand, demanding attention. "This is weird," Danny said, and I could hear the unease in his voice. "Real weird. Animals don't act like this." But to me, it felt right, like I'd finally found the place I was supposed to be, and these animals knew it even before I did. "Thanks for the ride," I told Danny, my voice thick with emotion. "I think I'm going to stay here for a while." He looked uncertain. "You sure? Place looks abandoned. You got somewhere to sleep? Food?" I nodded, even though I had no idea what I'd find inside the buildings. "I'll be okay. Thank you for bringing me here." Danny handed me a business card with his number. "You need anything, you call. I do supply runs out here twice a month, and I can check on you." After he drove away, I stood in the clearing and slowly turned in a circle, taking in every detail of the farm. Someone had been maintaining it minimally, enough to keep the animals fed and the worst of the decay at bay. But it was clear that no one actually lived here. The farmhouse windows were dark and dusty, the porch steps needed repair, and weeds grew thick around the foundations. I walked to the front door, half expecting it to be locked, but the handle turned easily. Inside, the house smelled musty and old, but it was furnished and intact. A living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with vintage appliances, and a dining table covered in dust. Upstairs, I found 3 bedrooms, one of them clearly belonging to a child at some point, based on the smaller bed and the faded animal drawings taped to the walls. In that child's room, I found something that made my knees weak. On the dresser was a photograph in a silver frame, the same photograph I had in my backpack. My mother standing in front of the barn, holding a baby. But this print was clearer, not faded, and I could see details I'd missed before. My mother was wearing a necklace with a small horse pendant. Behind her, partially visible through the barn door, was someone else, an older woman with silver hair pulled back, watching with a soft smile. I picked up the frame with shaking hands and turned it over. Taped to the back was another note in the same handwriting from my original note. "Anna and Lily, summer 2006, first day home at Willowbrook." Anna. My mother's name was Anna. I sat down hard on the dusty bed, the frame clutched to my chest, and let myself cry. Not sad tears, but relief. This was real. This farm had been my home, however briefly. My mother had lived here with me, and someone had loved us enough to preserve this place, to keep it waiting for me, even after everyone was gone. I spent the rest of that day exploring every corner of the farm. In the barn, I found more evidence of our life here. A tack room with saddles labeled with names, one small saddle marked Lily's Pony. A workshop where someone had carved wooden figures, dozens of them lined up on shelves, horses and cattle and wild animals, all crafted with the same skill as the figurine my mother had left me. In the farmhouse basement, I discovered boxes of documents that told the story I'd been missing my entire life. Property deeds showing that Willowbrook Farm had been owned by Margaret Ashworth since 1973. Letters between Margaret and my mother, Anna, starting when Anna was 18 and pregnant with me, continuing through my early childhood. They revealed that Margaret was my maternal grandmother, that my mother had come to live with her here after my father, whoever he was, disappeared. The letters painted a picture of 3 years of happiness. Anna learning to run the farm, me growing from a baby into a curious toddler who apparently spent every waking moment following my grandmother around and playing with the animals. And then, abruptly, the letters stopped in 2009 when I was 3 years old. I found the explanation in a newspaper clipping folded carefully into one of the boxes. A car accident on a mountain road about 30 miles from the farm. Anna Ashworth, 25 years old, died at the scene. Her daughter, Lily, 3 years old, survived with minor injuries and was placed in state custody after no immediate family could be located. But that didn't make sense. Margaret had been alive. Why hadn't she taken me? I found the answer in a journal, Margaret's journal, dated from 2009 onward. She'd been sick, diagnosed with cancer just months before my mother's accident. By the time social services tried to contact her, she was in intensive treatment, deemed unable to care for a young child. She'd fought the decision, but the state had moved quickly, placing me in foster care while she was too weak to contest it. She'd written page after page about her guilt and grief, losing her daughter and then losing me, unable to fight for custody while battling a disease that was slowly killing her. But she'd made plans. She'd set up a trust to maintain the farm, arranged for a local rancher to care for the animals, and left instructions that when I turned 18 or sought out the farm, everything would transfer to my name. If Lily ever finds her way home, she'd written in her final entry, dated 2011, she'll know this place. The animals will remember her, even if she doesn't remember them. Animals know things we forget. They'll show her she belongs here. She'd died 3 months after that entry, leaving the farm in a kind of stasis, maintained but empty, waiting for me to come back. I read until dark, then sat on the porch steps as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The animals had settled for the night, but that border collie, whose name I learned from the journal was Scout, lay beside me with her head on my leg. This was my home, had been my home, and my grandmother had preserved it for me, trusting that somehow, someday, I'd find my way back. Over the next few weeks, I made Willowbrook Farm mine. I called the attorney whose name I'd found in Margaret's documents, a kind man named Robert, who'd been maintaining the trust for 13 years. He seemed genuinely happy to finally transfer ownership to me. Your grandmother was very specific in her wishes, he told me over the phone. She wanted you to have everything with no conditions, no obligations. If you choose to keep the farm, wonderful. If you want to sell it and start fresh somewhere else, that's your choice to make. But she hoped you'd feel the connection to this place that she and your mother felt. I did feel it. Every morning when I woke up in my mother's old room, now cleaned and aired out. Every afternoon spent learning how to care for the animals with guidance from Walter, the neighboring rancher who'd been tending them for years. Every evening sitting on the porch and watching the sky change colors while Scout pressed against my side. Walter was in his 70s, weathered and kind, with stories about my mother and grandmother that brought them to life in ways documents never could. "Your mama loved those horses," he told me one day while we repaired a fence. "She'd spend hours just sitting in the pasture with them, talking like they understood every word. And you were the same when you were small. Couldn't have been more than 2 years old, but you'd toddle out there and those horses would follow you around like you were the Pied Piper." The animals did seem to remember me, or at least they recognized something in me. The chestnut horse, whose name was Cinnamon, according to the records I found, became my constant companion. She'd follow me around the property, and when I started riding her, tentatively at first, with Walter's patient instruction, it felt natural in a way that made no logical sense. I also discovered that I'd inherited my grandmother's skill for wood carving. One rainy afternoon, I picked up some of her tools and a piece of pine, and my hands seemed to remember what my brain had forgotten. By evening, I'd carved a passable rabbit, and Walter laughed when he saw it. "You're Margaret's granddaughter, all right. She could make wood tell stories." I didn't go back to Riverside. Instead, I called Mrs. Palmer from a phone I bought in town and explained where I was. She was relieved I was safe, and after some discussion with social services, they agreed to emancipate me early, given that I had stable housing and resources. The fact that I owned property outright probably helped. "You found what you were looking for," Mrs. Palmer said during one of our calls, and it wasn't a question. "I found where I came from," I corrected, "and where I belong." The farm wasn't easy. I was 17 years old, trying to run an operation I barely understood, caring for animals I was still learning about, and managing property that needed constant maintenance. But Walter helped me, as did Danny when he made his supply runs, and gradually I built a network of neighbors and other farmers who offered advice and assistance. I also found my mother everywhere. In the garden she'd planted that had gone wild, but still produced tomatoes and herbs. In the carved initials on the barn wall, AA plus LA, Anna Ashworth and Lily Ashworth. In the vinyl records she'd collected that I played on the old turntable in the living room, filling the empty house with music that felt like memory. 1 year after I fled Riverside, I stood in the same spot where I'd first arrived at Willowbrook Farm. But now I wasn't a scared runaway with $40 and a desperate hope. I was Lily Ashworth, owner of a working cattle and horse farm in Montana. I'd finished my high school diploma through online courses. I'd learned how to ride, how to mend fences, how to read weather patterns, and manage a herd. I'd carved over 100 wooden figures that I sold at a local craft market, building on my grandmother's reputation for quality work. Most importantly, I'd found my story. The gap in my identity that had haunted me for 14 years had been filled in with truth and love and purpose. The animals still greeted me every morning like I was someone special. Cinnamon would nicker softly when I came to the barn. Scout would press against my legs while I drank coffee on the porch. The chickens would cluster around my feet, waiting for feed. And every time they did, I remembered my grandmother's words from her journal. "Animals know things we forget. They'll show her she belongs here." They had shown me. They'd recognized what I couldn't, that I was finally home. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched something in you, please subscribe to this channel. We share stories about finding yourself, fighting for what matters, and discovering that home isn't always where you start, but where you're meant to be. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever felt drawn to a place you'd never been before? Have you discovered something about your past that changed your future? Let's talk about it. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And check out the other stories on screen. They might surprise you in the best way. Until next time, remember that sometimes the path home is the one you have to find for yourself.